My phone buzzed as the town car glided smoothly through the neon-lit streets of downtown Chicago. It was a text from my dad, Richard. "Oops, we forgot your seat for the birthday dinner tonight." So embarrassing. I stared at the screen. It was not a mistake. It was a test. A calculated move to put me in my place. I typed back two simple words. "No problem." 30 minutes later, my husband David and I walked into the most exclusive steakhouse in the city. The moment we stepped inside, all 14 staff members stopped moving. The restaurant fell completely silent. David glanced over at my family crammed around a small table in the corner, laughing loudly. The general manager rushed to our side, followed David's gaze, and whispered, "Sir, shall I remove their table?" Before I tell you what I said next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who thought they had the upper hand. My name is Lauren, and I am 33 years old. I sat in the back of the plush leather seat of our private car watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. I handed the phone to David. He adjusted his bespoke suit cuffs, his dark eyes scanning the glowing screen. He did not look surprised. He just looked disappointed. David is 35, the chief operating officer of my company, and the only person who knows the full extent of my wealth. He handed the phone back to me with a sigh. "You know he did this on purpose, right?" I nodded, slipping the phone into my designer purse. Of course he did. He planned a birthday dinner for 6 people. Him, my mother, Patricia, my younger sister, Amanda, and her husband, Andre. The math was not hard. Leaving me out was the entire point of the evening. David leaned back against the headrest, shaking his head. "It is exactly like your college graduation. He told you the dinner reservations were full, then took Amanda out for prime rib while you ate takeout in your dorm room. And your wedding rehearsal dinner." I let out a sharp breath, remembering how my mother claimed they could not afford to invite David's parents only to buy Amanda a new luxury SUV the very next week. "They want me to react," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady. "They want me to send a long emotional text begging for an explanation. Or better yet, they want me to show up crying so they can call me unstable and dramatic in front of Andre." David looked out the window, a small, dangerous smile playing on his lips. "Andre is going to be there. The golden son-in-law. He just got promoted to vice president at his corporate brokerage firm. I am sure Richard is dying to show him off while simultaneously reminding you that you are just a struggling nobody." I crossed my arms, feeling the cool silk of my blouse. They still think I am a low-level office assistant. I let them believe it because it was easier than dealing with their endless greed and constant competition. When I founded Apex Hospitality and Real Estate Holdings 7 years ago, I made sure my name was buried under 3 layers of corporate shielding. My family is obsessed with status, but they are incredibly lazy when it comes to actual financial research. David reached over and took my hand. His grip was firm and grounding. "Are you sure you want to do this tonight? We could just go home, open that vintage bottle we bought in Napa, let them have their sad little dinner." I shook my head, my jaw tightening with resolve. "No. Tonight is the night. Richard has spent my entire life using money and access as a weapon to make me feel small. He thinks he is the king of Chicago because he has a country club membership and a house in the suburbs that is secretly drowning in debt. He needs a reality check, and I am going to deliver it." David chuckled softly. The executive in him loved a well-executed strategy. "What is the play?" I looked at him, my mind already calculating the variables. We go in. We do not cause a scene. We let them dig their own graves. Every time they try to insult us, we let them. We give them enough rope to hang themselves, and then we drop the floor out from under them. The car slowed to a stop in front of the Monarch. It is the kind of restaurant where reservations take 6 months and the steaks cost more than a car payment. It is also the crown jewel of my commercial real estate portfolio. I bought the building 18 months ago. My family has absolutely no idea. The valet opened the door and the crisp night air hit my face. David stepped out first, offering his hand. As we walked up to the heavy mahogany doors, the doorman instantly stood up straighter. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," he said seamlessly, pulling the doors open. He did not ask for a name. He did not check a guest list. He just ushered us into the dimly lit, opulent foyer. The smell of truffle and dry, aged beef filled the air. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the velvet booths. I scanned the room and spotted them immediately. They were tucked in a mid-tier section near the swinging kitchen doors. A table for 6 currently occupied by 4 people. Richard was at the head of the table, his face red from cheap wine and loud boasting. Patricia was next to him wearing a dress that screamed trying too hard to look wealthy. Across from them sat Amanda flipping her perfectly highlighted hair, and Andre looking sharp in a tailored suit, checking his gold watch every 2 minutes to make sure people noticed it. I took a deep breath and walked toward them, David right beside me. Our footsteps were barely audible over the low hum of wealthy patrons, but Amanda has a radar for anything she can criticize. She spotted me when I was still 10 feet away. Her loud grating voice cut through the sophisticated atmosphere. "Oh my gosh, what are you doing here?" Amanda practically shouted, causing the tables nearby to pause their conversations and stare. Richard stopped laughing. Patricia froze with her wine glass halfway to her mouth. I stopped at the edge of their table, offering a calm, pleasant smile. "Happy birthday, Dad. I got your text about the seating mix-up. Do not worry about it. David and I decided to come anyway." Richard recovered quickly, his face twisting into a sneer of fake paternal concern. "Lauren, sweetheart, I told you we did not have room. This is a very exclusive restaurant. You cannot just crash a reservation like a teenager crashing a party." Patricia chimed in, using her signature weaponized sweetness. "Honey, we just wanted a small, intimate family dinner. Besides looking at the menu, I really do not think this is in your budget. Did you look at the prices before you came down here? I know things are tight for you at that little tech startup you work for." I did not flinch. I just looked at her, my expression completely neutral. "I am perfectly aware of the prices, Mom." Amanda scoffed, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms defensively. "Right, you probably saved up for months just to walk through the door. Honestly, Lauren, it is really embarrassing that you showed up uninvited. Andre is treating us tonight to celebrate his huge new promotion. We do not want to ruin the sophisticated vibe with you complaining about how expensive the side dishes are." Andre offered a condescending, pitying smile, adjusting his silk tie. "It is all right, Amanda. If Lauren wants to grab a seat at the bar, I can throw a couple of appetizers on my black card. It is a big night for me at the firm. I do not mind helping out family who are struggling." He emphasized the word family as if I was a charity case they picked up off the street. David stepped forward slightly, his presence immediately commanding the space. Andre might have been a vice president, but David carried the quiet, lethal authority of a man who owned the bank. "That is a very generous offer, Andre. But Lauren and I will be fine." Richard slammed his hand on the table, rattling the expensive silverware. "Enough. You are making a scene, Lauren. I am not asking the waiters to squeeze 2 more chairs at this table. It is humiliating for my image. You need to leave. Go get a burger somewhere, and I will call you this weekend when I have time." The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the air. He wanted to dismiss me like a disobedient child in front of a room full of powerful strangers. But before I could respond, the entire atmosphere in the restaurant suddenly shifted. It was palpable. The general manager, a distinguished man named Thomas, who had run the Monarch for 20 years, was practically sprinting across the dining room floor. He bypassed my father entirely, completely, ignoring Richard's raised hand signaling for more water. Thomas stopped inches from David, and me bowing his head respectfully. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, I am so incredibly sorry. I had no idea you were coming in tonight. The executive chef has already started preparing your usual order." The entire table stared in stunned, breathless silence. Amanda's mouth hung open. Richard looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. Andre lowered his gold watch, his arrogant smile vanishing instantly. The sheer audacity of Richard telling me to go get a burger while he sat in my building was poetic. I stood perfectly still next to David, letting the weight of his insults settle over the table. Patricia offered a tight fake smile while Amanda eagerly watched to see if I would break down. Andre just looked bored. They were so wrapped up in their arrogance that they missed the massive shift happening around them. Within seconds, the restaurant came to a grinding halt. At the front of the room, the head hostess hurriedly picked up a discreet radio. In the open kitchen, the executive chef wiped his hands on a towel and stood at rigid attention. I watched as 14 different staff members, from sommeliers to busboys, completely stopped what they were doing and faced our direction. The sophisticated hum of the dining room evaporated, replaced by heavy silence. People at nearby tables turned to see what important dignitary just walked into the room. Richard noticed the silence, too. He puffed out his chest, completely misreading the situation. He assumed the staff noticed the awkward family confrontation and were stepping in to handle the unwanted guests. He snapped his fingers loudly to get the attention of the general manager. Thomas was a seasoned hospitality veteran who was moving quickly across the floor, his eyes locked entirely on David and me. Richard offered a smug, victorious smile as Thomas approached. "Thank goodness," Richard said loudly, making sure the surrounding tables could hear him. "Thomas, my good man. I am so sorry for the disturbance. My daughter and her husband just showed up without a reservation and are refusing to leave. If you could please have security escort them out, I would greatly appreciate it." Thomas did not even blink at Richard. He walked right past his outstretched hand, coming to an immediate halt, exactly 2 feet in front of David and me. Thomas gave a deep, respectful bow, a gesture he reserved strictly for the elite tier of Chicago society. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell." Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly with genuine anxiety. "I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea you were coming in this evening. The front desk did not alert me until you were already on the floor. Please accept my deepest apologies for the oversight. The executive chef is preparing your usual orders as we speak." The words hung in the air, echoing in the quiet dining room. The reaction from my family was instantaneous and beautiful to witness. Amanda's jaw actually dropped open in pure shock. Patricia dropped her heavy silver fork against her porcelain plate. Andre suddenly sat up completely straight, his corporate instincts sensing a massive shift in the power dynamic he could not comprehend. Richard looked like he had been physically slapped, his face turned a blotchy shade of purple. "Thomas," Richard stammered, his voice losing all of its previous booming authority. "Thomas, what are you doing? These are not VIPs. This is my daughter Lauren. She works as a secretary. She cannot afford a glass of water in this place. Why are you bowing?" Thomas finally turned his head to look at Richard. The warmth and deference he had just shown to me completely vanished. His expression turned icy and thoroughly professional. Sir Thomas said firmly, "I would ask that you lower your voice. You are speaking to the owners. If a bomb had gone off in the middle of the table, it could not have caused more devastation than those words. The owners." Richard repeated the words weakly. Andre looked down at his own expensive suit, then looked up at David, bespoke tailoring, realizing the quiet man standing next to me was wearing a watch worth more than Andre's entire annual salary. Thomas turned his attention back to David, leaning in slightly so his next words would not be broadcast to the entire room. But the silence was so profound that my family heard every single syllable. Sir Thomas whispered to David, his eyes darting briefly toward Richard. "Shall I remove their table? They are clearly causing you distress, and I can have security clear them out." David looked at me, a calm, knowing expression on his face. This was my moment. The power was entirely in my hands. With one nod, I could have the father who spent my entire life belittling me dragged out of the restaurant he idolized. I could strip away the fake glossy image they worked so hard to maintain. It would be incredibly easy to do. But getting them thrown out would mean they could leave and spin the story however they wanted. They would tell the extended family that I had gone crazy and abused my newfound power. I did not want them to leave. I wanted them to stay and feel the absolute crushing weight of their own insignificance. I wanted them to realize I held the keys to their reality. "No, Thomas." I said, my voice perfectly level and friendly. "Do not remove them. They are here to celebrate my father's birthday. I would not dream of ruining his special night. In fact, I want them to have the best view. Please seat us at the owner booth." Thomas nodded, immediately relieved that no one was getting fired. Right away, Mrs. Caldwell. Right this way. The owner booth at the Monarch is not just a table, it is a statement. It is elevated on a raised platform at the very back of the main dining room, giving whoever sits there a sweeping, unobstructed view of the entire restaurant. It is surrounded by deep velvet curtains. Sitting at that booth meant you were looking down on everyone else in the room, literally and figuratively. As Thomas led us away, I did not look back at my family. I could feel their eyes burning into my back. David pulled out my chair, holding my hand, as I stepped up onto the platform and took my seat. The leather was soft and inviting. A sommelier immediately appeared, pouring a glass of sparkling water before I even had to ask for it. I looked down from my elevated position and met Richard's eyes. He was staring up at me, completely frozen in his chair. He looked small. For the first time in my life, my father looked genuinely intimidated by me. Patricia was frantically whispering to Amanda, her hands shaking. Andre was furiously typing on his phone, searching my name in corporate registries, desperately trying to figure out how he had so deeply miscalculated our net worth. The stage was perfectly set. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely obliterated. They had spent the evening trying to push me out the door, only to realize I owned the building they were sitting in. The best part was that the night was only just beginning. I took a slow sip of my water, leaning back into the luxurious booth. They wanted to play games with money and status. They challenged the wrong player. I watched from our elevated vantage point as the panic at my family table began to shift into damage control. Richard was still frozen, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and deep humiliation. Andre was frantically swiping at his phone screen, trying to make sense of a reality he could not compute. But my mother, Patricia, had a completely different coping mechanism. Whenever the family was backed into a corner, she deployed her ultimate weapon: fake sugary sweetness combined with aggressive incompetence. She smoothed her overpriced silk dress, pasted a warm smile onto her face, and stood up. She walked toward the owner booth with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who believed she could charm her way out of a burning building. David took a slow sip of his water. "Here she comes," he murmured quietly. "The peace treaty." I shook my head. "It is not a peace treaty. It is a leash. She is coming over here to try and put it back on me." As Patricia climbed the short staircase to our platform, she clasped her hands together in front of her chest, playing the role of the innocent peacemaker perfectly. "Oh, Lauren, sweetheart," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial affection that made my skin crawl. She stopped right at the edge of our table, looking around the luxurious velvet curtains and the crystal fixtures with a dismissive little laugh. What an absolute misunderstanding this entire evening has been. I did not invite her to sit down. I simply looked at her, letting the silence stretch out until it became uncomfortable. Patricia hated silence. She hated anything she could not immediately control with a compliment or a guilt trip. When I did not offer a polite response, she plowed ahead, leaning in closely as if we were sharing a secret. "Your father is just so incredibly terrible at planning, honey. He made the reservation weeks ago and just completely miscounted the chairs. He thought he asked for a table of 6, but the restaurant made a mistake and only gave us a 4-top. It was just a silly administrative error. It is nothing for you to be upset about." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking, even for her. It ignored the very clear text message sitting in my purse. The text where Richard explicitly said they forgot my seat and called it embarrassing. She was standing in front of me, asking me to reject my own reality and accept her highly sanitized version of events. It was the exact same tactic she used when I was 12 and Amanda ruined my science fair project. Patricia had told me Amanda was just trying to help me paint it and that I was being ungrateful for yelling at her. She had spent 33 years rewriting history to protect her golden child and her arrogant husband. But this time, I was not a 12-year-old girl desperate for her mother to validate my feelings. I was a grown woman sitting in the most powerful seat in the room. I smiled, a tight expression that did not reach my eyes. "Is that so, Mom? A simple miscount. Patricia nodded enthusiastically. Yes, exactly. Just a silly mistake by the reservation desk. Her eyes darted around the owner booth again, taking in the premium champagne bucket sitting empty on the ice, the heavy silver cutlery, and the sweeping view of the dining floor. Her expression shifted from fake apology to thinly veiled condescension. Though I have to admit, Lauren, it is very resourceful of you and David to manage getting this booth. We all know how exclusive this section is. She turned her attention to my husband, giving him a patronizing smile. David, you must have been saving up your credit card reward points for years to pull this off. Or did you have to open a new line of credit just to impress the manager? I know you young people love to live beyond your means for a good social media picture, but you really should not go into debt just to prove a point to your father. David did not even blink. He looked at Patricia with the calm, detached amusement of a scientist observing a very predictable lab rat. We did not use points, Patricia, he said evenly, his voice smooth and completely devoid of the defensive tone she was desperately trying to provoke. And we certainly do not carry debt. But I appreciate your deep concern for our financial well-being. Patricia let out a high-pitched laugh, waving her hand as if batting away a fly. Well, however you managed to sweet-talk the staff, it really is completely unnecessary. Her smile dropped slightly, and the sweet maternal facade cracked just enough to reveal the controlling matriarch underneath. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Now, Lauren, listen to me. Your father is very upset right now. Today is his birthday, and he works very hard to provide the lifestyle and the reputation that this family enjoys. You showing up out of nowhere and causing a scene with the manager has embarrassed him deeply in front of Andre. You know how important Andre is to this family. We cannot afford to have you throwing a tantrum and ruining the aesthetic of the evening. I need you to lower your voice, act like a mature adult, and stop this ridiculous charade. I looked down at the main floor. Richard was watching us intensely, trying to look imposing but failing miserably. You want me to lower my voice? I asked softly. Patricia nodded, her eyes flashing with a stern warning. Yes. I want you to sit here quietly, eat your dinner, and when the bill comes, I expect you to walk over to our table and apologize to your father. I let out a quiet laugh. It was not a laugh of anger but of pure disbelief. She was standing in a restaurant I owned, lecturing me about a man secretly drowning in multiple mortgages and worrying about a son-in-law who was about to lose his career. She was completely blind to the trap she was walking into. I picked up the heavy menu from the center of the table and opened it. The prices inside were astronomical, designed strictly for the ultra-wealthy elite of the city. I looked up at Patricia, keeping my expression perfectly serene. You are right, Mom, I said smoothly, letting her believe she had won the psychological battle. Today is my father's birthday. We absolutely should not cause a scene or ruin the aesthetic of the evening. We should celebrate him exactly the way he deserves to be celebrated. Patricia visibly relaxed, a triumphant smirk replacing her stern frown. She firmly believed she had successfully put the scapegoat back in her designated place. Good girl, Patricia praised, patting the table patronizingly. I am happy you are finally being reasonable. Just stay out of the way. She turned and walked back down the stairs, unaware that her desperate need for control had just handed me the perfect opportunity to destroy them. Patricia stood by the velvet ropes of our elevated booth a little longer than necessary. She was soaking in the perceived victory. In her mind, she had just successfully put me back into the small, submissive box she had built for me decades ago. She smoothed her expensive silk dress, preparing to deliver the good news to my father. But just as she turned her heel, a movement caught her eye. The head sommelier of the Monarch was approaching our table. He was a distinguished older man, wearing a pristine, tailored suit. He carried a heavy leather-bound wine list tucked respectfully under his arm. Patricia stopped. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked at the sommelier, then darted back to David and me. A new and malicious idea was clearly forming in her head. She had already tried to establish social dominance by telling me to lower my voice and behave like a child. Now she wanted to establish financial dominance. She wanted to punish me. I could see the exact moment the thought crystallized behind her eyes. She took a step back toward our table, blocking the sommelier path just as he reached the top of the stairs. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with that same artificial sweetness she used whenever she was about to do something incredibly toxic. The sommelier stopped instantly, his posture perfectly rigid. "Good evening, madam," he replied with flawless professionalism. Patricia reached out and practically snatched the leather-bound wine list from under his arm. Let me see that, she demanded, not waiting for his permission. "You see, today is my husband's birthday, and we are looking for something truly spectacular to celebrate." The sommelier glanced briefly at me, a silent question in his eyes. I gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of my head. "Do not stop her. Let her speak." He turned his attention back to my mother, keeping his face completely neutral. "Of course, madam. We have an extensive collection in our cellar. Are you looking for a specific region or a particular vintage tonight?" Patricia ignored his helpful suggestions, flipping aggressively through the heavy parchment pages of the menu. Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers, entirely skipping the beautifully written descriptions of the wine itself. She was not looking for a flavor profile or a perfect pairing for her steak. She was looking for a weapon. She wanted a price tag high enough to cause me genuine physical anxiety. She flipped past the $300 bottles with a scoff. She completely ignored the $800 options. She finally stopped near the very back of the book, landing on the exclusive reserve list kept strictly for VIP clients. A triumphant smile spread across her face. "Oh, this looks absolutely perfect," she announced loudly. Her voice was intentionally pitched up, ensuring that Amanda and Andre could hear her from their table down below. "We will take a bottle of the Chateau Margaux Grand Cru, the 1990 vintage." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the page and tapped it sharply. The sommelier maintained his professional composure, though his eyes widened just a fraction at her sheer audacity. "An excellent choice, madam. That particular vintage is incredibly rare and highly sought after. The price is $4,000 for the bottle. Shall I prepare it for your table immediately?" Patricia let out a theatrical, breathy laugh, as if spending $4,000 on fermented grape juice was a casual, everyday occurrence for her. "Oh, heavens, no," Patricia said, turning her cold gaze directly toward me. "You will not be putting that on our bill. My daughter Lauren will be paying for it." The air in the VIP booth grew suddenly very still. Down on the main floor, I saw Richard sit up straighter, a smug grin spreading across his face. Amanda leaned over and whispered something to Andre, who let out a low, arrogant chuckle. Patricia looked at me, her eyes hard and calculating, despite the bright smile plastered on her lips. "You know, Lauren, it really was quite rude of you to show up to your father's birthday dinner completely empty-handed. We raised you to have much better manners than that. I know things are very tight for you right now, and I know your little administrative job does not pay very well, but family is family. You should have at least brought a card or a modest token of appreciation. Since you completely forgot his special day, this beautiful bottle of wine will be your gift to him. You can just go ahead and put it on your tab. It is the absolute least you can do after crashing our private dinner and causing such an embarrassing scene at the front door." David shifted in his leather seat beside me. I could feel the intense frustration radiating from him. He was a master of self-control, but listening to this woman belittle his wife and attempt to extort thousands of dollars from her was pushing his absolute limits. He opened his mouth to speak, ready to completely eviscerate her logic and expose her massive debts right then and there. I reached under the table and placed my hand firmly over his knee. I squeezed twice. It was our silent signal. "Stand down. Let her dig the hole much deeper." I looked up at Patricia. I did not frown. I did not look panicked or angry or ashamed. I smiled. It was a soft, pleasant smile that completely unnerved her. She had fully expected me to gasp at the price tag. She had expected me to stammer, to make desperate excuses, to beg her to pick something cheaper. She wanted to watch me squirm in front of David, to expose me as a financial fraud who could not afford to sit in the owner booth. When I did none of those things, her confident smile faltered just a millimeter. I turned my attention away from her and looked directly at the sommelier. He stood perfectly still, holding the wine list waiting for my final command. He knew exactly who I was. He knew that if I wanted to, I could have an entire case of that rare wine sent to my house for free. He also knew that my mother had absolutely no idea she was trying to flex her financial muscles inside my bank vault. I looked him directly in the eyes. "Please bring the Chateau Margaux to my father table," I instructed, my voice smooth and totally unbothered. "Make sure it is decanted properly for them." The sommelier gave a deep, understanding bow. "Right away, Mrs. Caldwell." He turned and walked briskly toward the cellar. Patricia stared at me for a long second, trying to find a crack in my armor. Finding none, she spun around and marched triumphantly back down the stairs to her table. David leaned close to my ear. "You know that charge is going directly onto their final bill, right?" I took a sip of my sparkling water, watching my family excitedly prepare for their incredibly expensive unpaid wine. "Yes," I whispered back. "The trap is set." I watched Patricia descend the stairs of the VIP platform with a bounce in her step. She genuinely believed she had just won a massive psychological victory by ordering a $4,000 bottle of wine on my imaginary tab. But as she returned to her seat, down on the main floor, the power vacuum she left behind was immediately noticed by the one person at the table with the biggest ego. Andre. From my elevated view, I watched him adjust the cuffs of his tailored suit, shoot a cocky smile at Amanda, and push his chair back. Andre had recently been promoted to vice president at a prestigious corporate brokerage firm. In his mind, this made him the undisputed king of our family dynamic. He was a man who thrived on being the smartest and wealthiest person in any room, completely unaware that the room he was currently standing in was owned by the woman he constantly ridiculed. He began walking toward our booth with a slow, deliberate swagger. He wanted to make sure the other patrons saw him approaching the exclusive owners section. He wanted to look like he belonged up here with us. David noticed him coming and let out a quiet, amused breath. He took a sip of his sparkling water and leaned back against the plush leather seat. "Here comes the alpha male," David murmured softly. I kept my face perfectly neutral. "Let him talk," I replied. "He loves the sound of his own voice more than anything else in the entire world." Andre reached the top of the stairs and stopped right at the edge of our table. He did not ask for permission to join us, nor did he offer a polite greeting. He simply leaned his forearm against the thick velvet rope that separated our booth from the rest of the restaurant, trying to look incredibly casual and dominant at the same time. He looked past me entirely, focusing his attention solely on David. In Andre's incredibly narrow worldview, men discussed business and money, while women just sat there and looked pretty. "How are you doing tonight, David?" Andre asked, his tone dripping with fake sympathy and extreme condescension. "Patricia just told us about the little misunderstanding with the reservations. And honestly, man, I have to say I am a little worried about you guys. I heard you had to pull some serious strings just to get seated up here. Look, I know it is Lauren's father's birthday and you want to make a good impression, but you really do not need to bankrupt yourself trying to keep up with my lifestyle. It is just not sustainable on a mid-level manager salary." I watched David's expression remain perfectly composed. He did not clench his jaw or narrow his eyes. He just looked at Andre with the mild, detached curiosity of a billionaire watching a toddler show off a shiny rock. "I appreciate the concern," David replied smoothly. "But I assure you we are completely comfortable." Andre let out a loud, patronizing chuckle, shaking his head as if David had just told a naive joke. "Come on, man, you do not have to put on a brave face for me. We are family. I know how the corporate grind works when you are stuck in the middle of the pack. You are, 35 now? You are getting to the age where you really need to start thinking about your long-term trajectory. If you are still just pushing papers at that little startup Lauren founded, you are going to get left behind. You have to be aggressive if you want to play in the big leagues." Andre paused, puffing out his chest slightly, to ensure his expensive silk tie was perfectly displayed under the ambient lighting. Take me, for example. I just hit vice president at my brokerage. Do you know how hard it is to secure that title before age 35? It takes absolute ruthless dedication. I am pulling down a base salary that most people will never see in their lifetime, plus performance bonuses that practically double it. I just bought Amanda a brand new imported SUV in cash last week, just because she said she liked the color. That is the level of financial freedom you should be aiming for, David. Not taking out secret loans just to buy a fancy dinner to impress your father-in-law. David slowly cut a small piece of his dry, aged steak, placing his knife down on the pristine white plate before responding. That is a very impressive accomplishment, Andre. You must be handling some very significant accounts to justify that kind of compensation structure. It was a perfectly neutral statement, but to a narcissist like Andre, it was an open invitation to brag even harder. Exactly, Andre beamed, completely missing the subtle trap David was laying out. I handle high net worth clients and massive commercial acquisitions, the kind of deals that make the front page of the Financial Times. And look, since we are family, I am willing to throw you a bone. If you ever want to get out of that dead-end job and make some real money, you should send me your resume. I could probably get you an entry-level position as an analyst on my team. It would be a pay cut at first, obviously, but you would be learning from the best. I could mentor you, teach you how to actually command a room. Andre gestured vaguely toward David's immaculate bespoke suit. And the first thing I would teach you is how to dress for the job you want. You look fine today, but if you want to close million-dollar deals, you need to invest in some custom tailoring. You cannot just buy off the rack and expect people to take you seriously in a boardroom. The sheer irony of his statement was almost too heavy to process. Andre was standing in a cheap mass-produced corporate suit, giving fashion advice to a man wearing a custom Italian masterpiece that cost more than Andre's entire watch collection. He was offering a junior analyst position to the chief operating officer of a holding company that possessed hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid assets. He was attempting to assert total dominance over the very man who actually controlled the financial strings of our entire local economy. I took a slow sip of my water, hiding the genuine smile that was threatening to break across my face. Andre was so desperate to be the alpha male of the family that he was completely blinding himself to the reality of the situation. He was practically begging us to destroy his ego. David wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, nodding slowly, as if he was deeply contemplating Andre's ridiculous offer. "That is very generous of you to offer your mentorship, Andre," David said, his voice laced with a subtle edge that only I could detect. "You mentioned you handle massive commercial acquisitions. That sounds like incredibly high-stakes work. You must be working on something truly spectacular to secure that promotion." David looked at Andre with the perfect expression of polite curiosity. That was all it took. Andre could never resist an opportunity to show off his perceived superiority. He shifted his weight, leaning his forearms heavily against the thick velvet rope that separated our elevated booth from the rest of the dining room. He lowered his voice, adopting the hushed, serious tone of a powerful insider, sharing highly classified information with a civilian. "You have a good eye, David," Andre said, flashing a blinding white smile. "You are absolutely right. I am not just moving residential properties or handling small-time retail leases. My firm gave me the reins on the most significant commercial acquisition this city has seen in the last 5 years. It is a $50 million portfolio buyout." I kept my hands resting quietly on my lap, my face completely impassive. $50 million. He was talking about my portfolio. He was talking about the exact deal my holding company was currently negotiating through a proxy legal team. I felt a sharp thrill of anticipation run down my spine, but I did not let a single emotion show on my face. David simply raised his eyebrows, looking suitably impressed. $50 million is a massive undertaking, David replied smoothly. A deal of that magnitude must require an incredible amount of logistical coordination. I imagine the buyer is keeping things extremely quiet. Andre let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, they are paranoid. The buyer is some holding company called Apex. They operate behind so many veils that nobody at my firm has seen the actual CEO. They just send their legal hounds. But that is why my managing partners put me in charge. I know how to handle these invisible billionaires. I know how to keep the sellers in line. If this deal closes next Friday, my commission alone will buy this entire restaurant. Andre looked around the dining room, his chest puffed out with sheer hubris. He genuinely believed he was the smartest man alive. He had fought hard to climb the cutthroat corporate ladder and wore his success like heavy armor. But instead of letting his achievements speak, he used them to beat down anyone he considered beneath him, including my husband. David took a slow sip of his water, his eyes fixed on Andre. Managing a $50 million portfolio is certainly impressive, David said softly. But with a secretive buyer like Apex, I assume you are locked behind a strict non-disclosure agreement. Deals like that require absolute confidentiality. Andre waved his hand dismissively. Oh, please. ND, as are just a formality to scare junior brokers. Besides, we are family. It is not like you two will run and tell the corporate press. You do not even know anyone in the commercial real estate sector. The disrespect was staggering, but exactly what David needed to pry the vault wide open. David leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the crisp white tablecloth. He lowered his voice, playing the eager amateur perfectly. I suppose that is true, but compiling a portfolio of that size must be incredibly difficult. Are they targeting downtown high-rises or industrial parks? I watched Andre face. For a fraction of a second, his corporate training kicked in. He knew that revealing the specific asset classes and locations of the Apex acquisition was a direct violation of federal trade secrets. But then he looked at David. His massive ego completely crushed his common sense. He leaned closer, a conspiratorial smirk spreading across his face. They are going after distressed hospitality assets, Andre whispered proudly. Luxury hotels and high-end restaurant buildings that took a beating recently. The sellers are desperate for cash, and Apex is swooping in to buy the debt. I am currently brokering the sale of 3 boutique hotels in the Loop and 4 premium restaurant locations in River North. One of the properties is just 3 blocks from here. The current owners are bleeding money. They are going to sign the transfer papers by Wednesday just to avoid bankruptcy. David nodded slowly, his face a mask of admiration. That is brilliant strategy, so you know exactly which properties Apex is acquiring. Andre laughed again. I know everything, David. I know the exact addresses. I know the seller's absolute bottom line. I even know the maximum bid Apex is willing to authorize, which means I can squeeze both sides to maximize my firm percentage. It is a bloodbath out there, and I am the one holding the sword. I felt my heart beat a little faster. He had done it. He had just admitted he was intending to manipulate my company maximum bid to artificially inflate his commission. It was not just a breach of his non-disclosure agreement. It was corporate fraud. He was actively working against his client, and his client was sitting less than 2 feet away. David picked up his crystal water glass, the corners of his mouth twitching upwards. You really are running the entire show, Andre. But surely your managing partners oversee the final negotiations. They would not leave a $50 million acquisition entirely in the hands of one vice president. Andre bristled instantly at the suggestion. His eyes narrowed and his arrogant tone returned. My managing partners do not do a thing. They sit in glass offices and play golf while I do the heavy lifting. I am the sole point of contact for the Apex legal team. I hold the keys to the entire kingdom. Without me, this deal falls apart completely. They need me a lot more than I need them. David set his glass down. The sharp clink of crystal echoed loudly in the quiet space. That is very good to know, Andre, David said quietly. His voice had lost all of its warmth. It was now pure, solid ice. It is always important to know exactly who is responsible when a deal of that magnitude experiences an unexpected complication. Andre completely missed the subtle but dangerous shift in David's tone. He stood up straight, brushing invisible lint off his lapel. Well, do not worry about me, David. I have everything under control. Just remember what I said about that junior analyst position. Send me your resume when you are ready to leave. We all have to start somewhere, right? With that parting shot, Andre gave a dismissive nod and walked back down the stairs. I watched him sit down whispering something to Amanda that made her giggle. They were celebrating a victory that did not exist. I slowly looked over at David. He pulled his phone from his suit pocket and calmly unlocked the screen. "Did you get all of that?" I asked softly. David pulled up his voice memo application. The screen showed a continuous red line. He tapped to save the file. Every single word David replied, his thumb hovering over his contact list. He just handed us his entire career on a silver platter. I smiled, reaching out to take a sip of my water. The appetizer course had not even arrived yet, and the golden son-in-law had already destroyed his own life. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in gluttony and fake wealth. From our elevated view in the owner booth, David and I enjoyed a quiet, perfectly executed meal. Down below, my family treated the menu like a stolen credit card. Richard ordered the imported A5 Wagyu beef with extra shaved truffles. Amanda and Andre ordered towers of chilled seafood and multiple rounds of top-shelf cocktails. Patricia flagged down the waiter every 15 minutes to demand more bread or complain about the lighting just to prove she belonged in a place like this. They drank the entire $4,000 bottle of Chateau Margaux without saving a single drop. They poured it generously, laughing loudly, and clinking their crystal glasses together in a toast to Andre and his upcoming promotion. They were celebrating a corporate victory that David had already recorded and planned to destroy. It was fascinating to watch them gorge themselves on luxury while standing on the absolute edge of financial ruin. They thought they were punishing me by racking up a massive bill, but they were really just digging their own grave deeper with every bite. As the plates were cleared and the dessert menus declined, Richard decided it was time for the grand finale of the evening. He leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket and wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He looked up at our booth with a deeply satisfied expression. He wanted to make sure I was paying attention. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers loudly in the air. It was an incredibly rude gesture that normally would have gotten him ignored in a restaurant of this caliber, but Thomas had instructed the staff to let my father dig his hole as deep as he wanted. Our dedicated waiter, a young man named Michael, walked over to their table immediately. He carried a small silver tray tucked under his arm, his posture completely professional. "Yes, sir," Michael asked, keeping his voice perfectly level. Richard puffed out his chest, preparing to deliver his lines to the entire dining room. "We are ready for the check," Richard announced loudly, making sure his voice carried over the ambient noise. "But I need you to split it." Richard stood up slightly, leaning over the table to ensure everyone heard his next instructions. "My daughter up there in the VIP section decided to crash my birthday dinner," Richard said, pointing a thick finger toward our booth. "She insisted on buying us an expensive bottle of wine to apologize for her rude behavior. So I want you to take the charge for the 1990 Chateau Margaux and put it entirely on her tab. Do not put a single penny of that wine on my bill. She needs to learn the value of $1, and I am not going to bail her out when her card declines. I want my bill to only include the food and the cocktails we ordered here at this table. Bring her the bill for the wine and let her figure out how to pay it." Patricia nodded enthusiastically, crossing her arms with a satisfied smile. Amanda leaned over and whispered something to Andre, who chuckled softly and adjusted his silk tie. They genuinely believed this was the ultimate power move. They thought they were publicly shaming me, exposing me as a fraud who tried to live outside my means. They wanted to watch the waiter march up to our booth and demand payment for a $4,000 bottle of wine I supposedly could not afford. Michael did not blink. He did not look up at me for confirmation because he already knew exactly how this transaction was going to be handled. He simply gave a polite, professional nod. "Of course," Sir Michael replied smoothly. "I will separate the wine charge and place it on Mrs. Caldwell's tab, exactly as you requested. I will print your itemized receipt for the remaining balance right now." Michael turned and walked swiftly toward the point-of-sale terminal near the kitchen doors. Down at the table, Richard settled back into his chair, looking incredibly proud of himself. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his thick leather wallet, placing it on the table with a heavy thud. He pulled out a gold-colored credit card, tapping it against the wood. He was ready to pay for his portion of the meal and walk out of the restaurant, leaving me behind to face the consequences of my imaginary poverty. David watched from our booth, a small smile playing on his lips. "The final act is starting," David whispered, taking a sip of his coffee. I leaned forward slightly, resting my chin on my hand. "Let us see how much he loves paying the bill," I replied. Less than 2 minutes later, Michael returned to the table. He carried a sleek black leather folio, holding it respectfully in both hands. He approached Richard and placed the folio gently on the table next to the gold credit card. "Your itemized receipt," Sir Michael said politely. "The cost of the reserve wine has been entirely removed from your total and transferred to the owner booth just as you asked. Whenever you are ready, I can process your payment." Michael took a step back, clasping his hands behind his back and waiting patiently. Richard offered a loud, arrogant laugh, picking up the leather folio with a dramatic flourish. "Excellent," Richard said loudly. "Let us see what the damage is for a little family birthday dinner." He opened the folio, flipping the cover back, to reveal the crisp white receipt tucked inside. Patricia leaned in close, expecting to see a very reasonable number now that the massive wine charge was gone. Amanda and Andre continued chatting, completely unbothered by the financial transaction happening next to them. I watched Richard face closely from my elevated position. The triumphant smile that had been plastered on his face all night vanished in a fraction of a second. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly shade of gray. He stared at the bottom of the receipt, his eyes wide and completely unblinking. He slowly brought his hands up, rubbing his eyes as if he genuinely believed his vision was failing him. But the numbers printed in bold black ink did not change. Richard had spent the entire evening ordering the absolute most expensive items on the menu, assuming the total would be manageable. He had ordered imported steaks, rare truffles, multiple seafood towers, and endless rounds of premium top-shelf cocktails. He had encouraged Amanda and Andre to order whatever they wanted, treating the menu like an endless fountain of wealth. He was so focused on pushing the $4,000 wine onto my tab that he lost track of his own reckless spending. The total printed at the bottom of his receipt for 4 people minus the wine was exactly $6,200. He slowly realized that his flimsy gold credit card could not possibly cover the massive bill, and his carefully crafted fake wealth was finally shattering. Richard stared at the total printed at the bottom of the receipt. $6,200. For a long moment, he did not move. He just sat there, breathing heavily through his nose. Then the shock morphed into angry denial. He firmly believed there had to be a mistake. He looked up at Michael the waiter with a patronizing glare. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharp and demanding. "I told you specifically to take the wine off this bill. You have clearly charged me for my daughter's expensive bottle." Michael stood perfectly still, holding his silver tray behind his back. Sir Michael replied calmly, "The $4,000 reserve vintage has indeed been removed. That total reflects only the steaks, the seafood towers, the appetizers, and the cocktails ordered directly by the 4 of you at this table." Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. The veins in his neck visibly bulged against his tight shirt collar. He knew he did not have the liquid funds to cover the astronomical charge, but his towering pride would absolutely not allow him to admit that in front of his golden son-in-law. Instead of reaching for his gold credit card, he slammed the leather folio shut with a violent crack and pushed it aggressively across the white linen tablecloth. "I am absolutely not paying this," Richard announced, his voice carrying sharply over the ambient noise of the dining room. "My daughter up there in the VIP section invited us here tonight. She is the one who wanted to celebrate my birthday, so she is footing the entire bill. Take this up to her table right now. Tell her to stop playing childish games and pay for her family like a respectful daughter." Patricia nodded along, offering her signature fake sweet smile. "Yes, please just take it up to Lauren," she added. "She loves to treat us." Amanda and Andre looked completely unbothered, expecting this to just be another normal instance of my parents bullying me into submission. They all watched Michael, expecting him to bow his head and carry the heavy financial burden up the stairs to my booth. Michael did not reach for the leather folio. He did not break eye contact with my father. He stood with the perfect upright posture of a highly trained hospitality professional who was about to drop an absolute bombshell. "I am afraid I cannot do that," Sir Michael said, his voice perfectly polite but entirely unyielding. Richard slammed his fist on the table, causing the silverware to rattle loudly. "Why not, Richard?" demanded, his voice echoing through the quiet restaurant. "Because she is your daughter, and I am telling you to take the bill to her." Michael took a tiny step back, allowing the words to fully breathe before he delivered them. "Because, sir, the people sitting in the owner booth do not pay for their meals. They own the building." The words left Michael's mouth and landed on the table like a physical weight. Down below, the reaction was instantaneous and completely devastating. Up in the booth, David took a slow, satisfied sip of his coffee. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the velvet barrier, watching the absolute destruction of my family, fabricated reality. Richard's jaw actually dropped open. The angry red flesh on his face vanished instantly, replaced by a sickening pale white. Patricia let out a strange, high-pitched gasp, raising a shaking hand to cover her mouth. She looked up at the elevated booth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter disbelief. Andre, the hotshot corporate vice president, physically recoiled in his chair. His analytical brain desperately tried to process the information. He looked around the massive, opulent restaurant, the crystal chandeliers, the velvet drapery, the dozens of elite staff members, and then looked back up at me. He was calculating the sheer net worth required to own a commercial property of this magnitude in downtown Chicago, and the math was absolutely breaking his mind. Amanda was the first to break the heavy, stunned silence. Her entire identity was wrapped up in being the wealthy, successful sister, and she simply could not accept a reality where I was vastly more powerful than her. "That is a complete lie," Amanda shrieked, her voice entirely losing its carefully practiced, sophisticated tone. She jumped up from her chair and pointed a trembling, manicured finger up at me. "She is just a low-level administrative assistant. She cannot even afford to buy a decent car, let alone a commercial building. There is absolutely no way she owns this place. She is lying to you to look important. She probably slept with the real owner to get that booth." Her accusations were desperate and pathetic, reflecting her own deep insecurities. Michael turned his cold, professional gaze toward Amanda. "Madam, I assure you my employers do not lie," Michael said firmly. "Mrs. Caldwell purchased this property 18 months ago. Now, if you would please provide a form of payment for the $6,200. The reality of the situation was finally sinking its teeth into Richard. He was sitting in my restaurant eating my food and racking up a bill he could not possibly pay. His entire image as the wealthy, successful patriarch was crumbling into dust right in front of the ambitious son-in-law he desperately wanted to impress. But severe narcissists do not surrender when they are cornered. They lash out blindly. They try to find a bigger weapon to regain control of the narrative and inflict maximum pain. Richard grabbed his thick leather briefcase from the floor next to his chair and hauled it onto his lap. His hands were shaking violently as he popped the brass latches open. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he dug frantically through the disorganized stacks of legal paper inside. "I am not playing this game," Richard bellowed, entirely abandoning any pretense of upper-class etiquette. "You think you can embarrass me, Lauren? You think because you somehow got your hands on some real estate that you can humiliate your own father on his birthday?" He pulled a thick legal document bound in blue paper from the depths of his briefcase and slammed it onto the table right next to the unpaid restaurant bill. "This is my will," Richard shouted, tapping his finger aggressively against the blue cover. "I just had my lawyers update it this morning. I have a massive estate, Lauren. I have a $2 million house in the best suburb in the state. I have antique cars. I have a legacy. And you know what this document says? It says you get absolutely nothing." Patricia started to cry, loud theatrical sobs meant to draw sympathy from the surrounding tables. Oh, Richard, please do not do this to our family, she wailed, completely ignoring the fact that she had just tried to extort $4,000 from me minutes earlier. Richard ignored her, staring directly up at me with wild, desperate eyes. I am officially disinheriting you, Lauren, he screamed. You are completely cut out. Every single penny of my wealth, every asset, every piece of property is going directly to Amanda and Andre. They are the only ones who respect this family. You are dead to me. You will never see a dime of my money. He stood there, chest puffed out, waiting for me to break down. He genuinely believed he had just played the ultimate trump card. He thought the threat of losing my inheritance would force me to run down the stairs crying and begging for his forgiveness. He thought his money was the ultimate leash. He had absolutely no idea that I already owned the bank that held all his secret debts, and that his precious $2 million estate was already mine. The echo of Richard screaming about disinheriting me faded into the high ceilings of the dining room. He stood there, panting slightly. His hand gripped the blue paper of his updated will so tightly his knuckles turned white. Down at the table, Patricia was dabbing her dry eyes with a linen napkin, playing the role of the devastated mother perfectly. Amanda and Andre looked up at me with smug anticipation. They were all waiting for the break. They were waiting for me to shatter into a million pieces, cry out for forgiveness, and beg my father not to cut me out of his imaginary fortune. Instead, I did the exact opposite. I raised my hands and slowly began to clap. The sound of my applause cut through the heavy silence of the restaurant like a sharp knife. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm. 1, 2, 3. I watched the triumphant smirk melt completely off my father's face. His wide eyes darted around the room as if searching for an explanation to a puzzle he could not solve. He looked at the blue paper in his hand and then back up to the VIP booth. He did not understand why the ultimate weapon of financial manipulation was not working. For 33 years, the threat of losing his money was the chain he used to drag me around. He genuinely believed that his wealth was the center of my universe. He had absolutely no idea that I had learned to fly a long time ago. I stopped clapping and rested my hands on the velvet barrier. I looked down at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small and insignificant. I did not feel any anger anymore. I only felt a deep, overwhelming sense of peace. That was quite a performance, Richard. I said, my voice perfectly calm and projecting effortlessly across the space. But you can put that blue piece of paper away. I do not want your $2 million house in the suburbs. I do not want your antique cars. And I certainly do not want any part of your legacy. I reached down into the designer bag resting on the seat beside me. It was a custom piece from Paris that Amanda had sneered at earlier, assuming it was just a cheap replica. My fingers brushed past my wallet and closed around a sleek, heavy black legal folder. I pulled it out and set it gently on the pristine white tablecloth. The leather cover absorbed the ambient light, looking dark and formidable. David shifted slightly in his chair next to me, adjusting his suit jacket. He knew exactly what was inside that folder. We had spent weeks preparing these documents, waiting for the perfect moment to execute our strategy. I tapped my manicured finger against the black leather once. Do you know what the biggest difference between us is, Richard? I asked softly, though the quiet room allowed every word to travel down to his table. You spend all your energy trying to look rich so strangers will respect you. I spend my energy actually building wealth, so I never have to care what anyone else thinks of me ever again. I opened the black folder. The crisp white pages inside were filled with dense legal text, official corporate seals, and financial statements that would make a seasoned investment banker sweat. I looked directly at Andre. The golden son-in-law was leaning forward slightly, his brow furrowed in confusion. He was a corporate shark, and his instincts were finally telling him that there was blood in the water. He just did not realize the blood was his own. Andre, I called out, addressing him directly for the first time since he came up to our booth to insult my husband. You came up here earlier bragging about a massive corporate promotion. You told David that you handle high-net-worth clients and multi-million-dollar acquisitions. You gave him unsolicited career advice and offered him an entry-level job at your brokerage firm. You even broke a strict non-disclosure agreement to brag about a $50 million portfolio buyout. Andre swallowed hard. The color began to drain from his face as his mind raced to connect the dots. He looked from me to the black folder and back to my face. His arrogant posture collapsed entirely. Yes, Andre. I continued, keeping my tone bright and conversational. You told us all about how you were the sole point of contact for a highly secretive holding company called Apex. You bragged about how you knew their maximum bids, their target properties, and their negotiation strategies. You said they operated behind veils and legal hounds. You said you had the buyers wrapped around your finger. I picked up the first document from the black folder. It was a certificate of incorporation bearing the official gold seal of the state. I held it up for the table to see. My name is not just on the deed to this restaurant building, I said clearly. I am the sole founder, the chief executive officer, and the majority shareholder of Apex Hospitality and Real Estate Holdings. If Michael the waiter revealing I owned the building was a bomb, this revelation was an absolute nuclear strike. The sheer magnitude of the information hit the table with devastating force. Amanda let out a short, high-pitched gasp and covered her mouth with both hands. Her eyes were wide with pure terror as she stared up at the sister she had mocked her entire life. Patricia sat frozen in her chair, her mouth hanging slightly open, unable to formulate a single coherent thought. But the reaction from Andre was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. He slumped back into his chair as if the bones in his spine had suddenly evaporated. The arrogant corporate vice president was hyperventilating. His eyes darted wildly around the room as the horrific reality of his situation crushed him. He had just openly confessed to corporate fraud right to my face. Richard slowly lowered the blue paper of his will. His hands were shaking violently now. The document slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor, landing next to his expensive leather shoes. He stared up at me, his face a mask of absolute horror. Apex, he whispered, his voice cracking horribly. You really own Apex. I nodded slowly, enjoying the total absolute defeat radiating from the table. Yes, Richard, I really own Apex. So please keep your will. Keep your big house and your cars and your carefully crafted illusion of superiority. You thought you could use a dinner invitation to remind me of my place in this family. But you forgot the most important rule of business. You never sit down at a table unless you know exactly who is holding all the cards. I watched my father struggle to process the fact that the daughter he constantly belittled was actually a multimillionaire. But as satisfying as that was, the evening was far from over. I turned my attention fully to Andre. The golden son-in-law was slouched back in his chair, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated. He was staring at the black Apex folder on the table as if it were a live grenade. The corporate bravado he wore like armor had been completely stripped away, leaving a terrified, hyperventilating man in a cheap suit. David leaned forward, resting his forearms on the velvet barrier of our elevated booth. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, lethal authority of a man who held a multi-million-dollar axe over Andre's career. Andre, David said, his voice smooth and incredibly sharp. When you came up to our table earlier, you were very eager to offer me a job. You told me I needed to learn how to play in the big leagues. You told me I needed to understand corporate strategy. Andre swallowed hard, his eyes darting wildly. David, please! Andre stammered, his voice thin and panicked. We are family. I was just giving you some advice. I did not mean any disrespect. I had no idea you were involved with Apex. David did not even blink. He reached into the black folder and pulled out a second document. It was a dense, highly confidential legal contract stamped with the red seal of Andre's brokerage firm. David held it up so Andre could clearly see the title. It was the master agreement for the $50 million Apex acquisition. You did not just give me advice, Andre. David continued, his tone perfectly even. You revealed highly classified trade secrets. You disclosed the targeted asset classes. You disclosed the locations of the distressed properties. You even admitted that you planned to manipulate our maximum bids to artificially inflate your own commission. And you did all of this to show off in front of your in-laws. Amanda finally found her voice, though it was shaking uncontrollably. "David, stop it!" she cried out, grabbing Andre's arm. "You cannot do this. He is a vice president. He just got a promotion. We just bought a new car." David looked at Amanda with cold, detached pity. "Yes, Amanda. He is a vice president. And as a vice president, he signed a highly restrictive, legally binding non-disclosure agreement when his firm took on Apex as a client. An agreement that he just completely shattered in the middle of a public restaurant." David placed the contract back into the folder and pulled out his phone. He unlocked the screen and pressed play on the voice memo application. The clear, undeniable sound of Andre's arrogant voice echoed from the small speaker. "They are going after distressed hospitality assets," the recording played. "Luxury hotels and high-end restaurant buildings. I am currently brokering the sale of 3 boutique hotels in the Loop and 4 premium restaurant locations. One of the properties is just 3 blocks from here. I know everything, David. I know the exact addresses. I know the seller's absolute bottom line. I even know the maximum bid Apex is willing to authorize, which means I can squeeze both sides to maximize my firm percentage." David paused the recording. The silence at the table was absolute and heavy. Andre looked like he was going to be sick. He put his head in his hands, realizing the sheer magnitude of his mistake. He had not just bragged to his brother-in-law. He had confessed to corporate fraud directly to the chief operating officer of the company he was trying to defraud. "You were right about one thing," Andre David said quietly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "You do hold the keys to the kingdom, but you forgot that we own the locks, and we do not do business with liabilities." David pulled a final piece of paper from the black folder. It was a formal letter of termination, drafted on heavy embossed Apex stationery. He folded it neatly and handed it down to Michael the waiter, who had been standing silently by the table the entire time. Michael took the letter and placed it gently on the table right in front of Andre. "As the chief operating officer of Apex Holdings," David announced, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence, "I am officially terminating all contracts, negotiations, and proxy agreements between Apex and your brokerage firm effective immediately. Your firm has been fired. The $50 million deal is dead." Andre let out a strangled sob. He knew exactly what this meant. He had built his entire career on the promise of closing the Apex deal. His promotion, his massive bonus, his entire reputation at the firm rested on this single acquisition. By losing the biggest client in the city due to a gross violation of an NDA, his firm would not just fire him. They would completely blackball him from the industry. His career was instantly and permanently over. Amanda began to cry hysterically, her carefully applied makeup running down her face. She looked at the termination letter and then up at me, her eyes filled with desperate panic. "Lauren, you cannot do this to us!" she wailed, abandoning her sophisticated persona entirely. "We have a massive mortgage. The payments on the new SUV are astronomical. If Andre loses his job, we will lose everything. We will be ruined. Please, you have to tell David to stop. You have to give him another chance. We are your family." I looked down at the sister who had spent my entire life mocking my clothes, my job, and my existence. The sister who had loudly proclaimed I should sit at the bar because I was ruining the aesthetic of her expensive dinner. The irony was so thick, you could cut it with a steak knife. I leaned forward, my voice perfectly calm and completely unyielding. "When you thought I was a struggling assistant, you told me to go eat a burger because I was embarrassing you," I replied softly. "You did not care if I was ruined. You did not care if I was humiliated. You only cared about your own image. So please, Amanda, do not play the family card now. You lost that privilege a long time ago." I turned my attention back to Andre, who was staring blankly at the table, completely broken. "I am sorry about your new car, Andre," I said, offering a tight, emotionless smile. "But like you told David earlier, If you want to play in the big leagues, you have to be aggressive. And you clearly underestimated who you were playing against. The golden son-in-law was officially defunded. His lavish lifestyle was completely destroyed, not by my anger, but by his own blind, staggering hubris. I sat back in the luxurious leather of the owner booth, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. The first target had been neutralized. Now it was time to deal with the patriarch. The silence that followed Andre being fired was thick and suffocating. Amanda was sobbing into her hands while Andre sat completely paralyzed, staring at his ruined career scattered across the white tablecloth. My father, Richard, could not handle the silence. He could not handle the reality that the power dynamic had completely inverted. For his entire life, he had been the loudest, most intimidating man in the room. He controlled everyone around him with his wallet and his temper. Seeing his golden son-in-law thoroughly dismantled by the daughter he considered worthless absolutely broke his brain. His face morphed from pale shock back to a deep, violent shade of crimson. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back so hard it screeched against the polished floor and tipped over backwards, crashing loudly. Several patrons at nearby tables gasped and turned to look, but Richard ignored them. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly up at our elevated booth. "You are a liar!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated rage. "You are a disgusting, manipulative liar, Lauren. You orchestrated this entire thing to ruin my birthday because you are a jealous, bitter little girl." David sat perfectly still beside me, his expression an unreadable mask of calm authority. I rested my chin on my hand, looking down at the red-faced man throwing a temper tantrum in the middle of a Michelin-starred dining room. "I did not orchestrate anything, Richard," I replied, my voice completely level. "You chose to send that text message excluding me. You chose to sit at a table for 4. You chose to order a $4,000 bottle of wine you could not afford. And you chose to try and humiliate me with the bill. All I did was show up and watch you trip over your own massive ego." But logic was completely lost on him. He slammed his fist down onto the table, making the empty wine glasses rattle violently. Patricia jumped in her seat, clutching her pearl necklace and looking around nervously. "Richard, please sit down," Patricia begged in a frantic whisper, finally realizing that the entire elite dining room was watching their spectacular public meltdown. "People are staring at us." But Richard ignored her completely. He was too far gone. He was desperately clinging to the crumbling edges of his fabricated reality. He could not accept that the black folder on the table was real. He could not accept that Apex Holdings was mine. "You do not own a damn thing," he shouted, pacing back and forth in front of his table. "You forged those papers. You hired some fake lawyers to print out those documents just to scare Andre. It is a pathetic stunt. You have been jealous of Amanda since you were a child. You could never stand the fact that she married a successful man while you married a mid-level nobody. You are just trying to drag us down to your miserable level." The sheer delusion of his rant was almost fascinating to witness. He was standing in a commercial property I owned, looking at a termination letter printed on my corporate letterhead and still trying to convince himself that I was a fraud. When the attacks on my character failed to provoke an emotional reaction from me, he immediately switched his tactics. If he could not tear me down, he would try to build himself up. He stopped pacing and puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket. He wanted everyone in the room to hear his next words. "You listen to me very carefully, Lauren," Richard bellowed, adopting the booming authoritative tone he used to terrify me when I was a child. "I am a self-made man. I built my fortune from the ground up with my own 2 hands. I did not need fake corporate papers to get where I am. I live in a $2 million estate in the most exclusive suburb in this state. I have a custom-built heated swimming pool, a 4-car garage filled with imported luxury vehicles, and a pristine credit score giving me access to anything I want. I am a platinum member at the Oak Ridge Country Club. I play golf with state senators and bank presidents. I am a pillar of this community. I have a legacy that you could never even begin to comprehend." He was shouting his resume to a room full of strangers, hoping that if he said the words loud enough, they would magically become true. He wanted to project the image of an untouchable titan of industry, an impenetrable fortress of wealth and prestige. He genuinely believed that his country club membership and his suburban mansion made him completely immune to consequence. He looked up at me with a sneer of absolute disgust, his eyes burning with defiance. "So go ahead and play your little games with Andre," he mocked, waving his hand dismissively at the broken man sitting at the table. "Fire him. Ruin his career. It does not affect me at all. I am bulletproof. I do not need a single dime of your imaginary money. I do not need your fake charity, and I certainly do not need your permission to live my life. I am a wealthy, successful man, and you are nothing but a disappointment to this family. You can keep your little restaurant, Lauren, because tomorrow morning I am going back to my massive, beautiful home, and I am going to forget you ever existed. I will never ask you for anything. I will never need you." He stood tall, breathing heavily, completely satisfied with his grand declaration of independence. He had wrapped himself in a warm, comforting blanket of financial delusion. He thought he had won the argument by proving he did not need me. He had absolutely no idea that his entire financial existence was a house of cards, and I was holding the match. I let Richard finish his grand speech. He stood there with his chest puffed out, breathing heavily, completely satisfied with his own lies. He genuinely believed that if he shouted about his $2 million house and his country club membership loudly enough, it would somehow magically protect him from the truth. Down at the table, Patricia was nodding along, desperately wanting to believe the illusion was still intact. Amanda was wiping her tears suddenly, looking hopeful that our father was actually the untouchable titan he claimed to be. David just leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Richard with a look of profound pity. "You are a self-made man, Richard," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the quiet air of the dining room. "You built a fortress of wealth and prestige. You play golf with senators, and you are completely bulletproof." Richard crossed his arms, his face still flushed with anger, but a smug smile returning to his lips. "That is exactly right," he snapped. "So you can take your little corporate papers and shove them. You have no power over me." I smiled, my expression completely devoid of anger or malice. It was a look of pure clinical execution. I reached down and slowly turned over the first page of the black legal folder resting on the table. "That is a fascinating narrative," Richard Fry said, my voice smooth and conversational. "It really is. It is the exact same story you have been telling this family and this city for the last 20 years. But there is a very big difference between telling a story and passing an audit. You see, when I founded Apex Holdings, I did not just focus on acquiring commercial real estate. That is only one division of our portfolio. The other division is entirely focused on financial acquisitions. Specifically, we buy up distressed debt bundles from local banks and private lenders. When someone takes out massive loans, they cannot afford to pay back. The banks eventually get tired of chasing them. They bundle those bad loans together and sell them to holding companies like mine for pennies on the dollar. It is an incredibly lucrative business if you know exactly where to look." Richard uncrossed his arms, his smug smile faltering slightly. He did not understand where this was going, but his survival instincts were finally starting to kick in. "What the hell does that have to do with me?" he demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its booming confidence. "It has everything to do with you, Richard," I replied, tapping the second page of the folder. "Because when you play golf with those bank presidents at your precious country club, you are not making business deals. You are begging them for extensions." I looked down at the crisp white paper, reading the bold black numbers printed across the top. "Your $2 million suburban estate is indeed a beautiful piece of property. But you do not own it. The bank owns it. Or rather, they did until last month. You took out your first mortgage 15 years ago to pay for the initial construction. But your lifestyle was much too expensive for your actual income. You wanted the heated pool, the imported marble floors, and the custom landscaping. So 7 years ago, you quietly took out a second mortgage to cover the massive credit card debt you accrued trying to keep up appearances. Patricia let out a sharp gasp, her eyes darting toward Richard. Richard, what is she talking about? Patricia whispered, her voice trembling. We paid off the house years ago. You told me we owned it free and clear. Richard ignored her, his eyes glued to the black folder on my table. Shut up, Patricia, he hissed through clenched teeth. She is lying. She is just making things up to sound important. I did not stop. I read the next line on the financial summary, my voice projecting clearly across the room. But 2 mortgages were not enough to sustain the illusion, were they, Richard? 3 years ago, when Amanda wanted a lavish destination wedding, you could not admit that you did not have the cash. So you went to a high-risk private lender and took out a third mortgage on the estate. A third mortgage with an absolutely predatory interest rate. You leveraged the very roof over your head just to pay for ice sculptures and a designer dress so your country club friends would think you were rich. Down at the table, Amanda went completely pale. She looked at the diamond ring on her finger and then at her father, realizing her entire wedding was funded by toxic debt. And it does not stop at the house, I continued, turning to the third page of this folder. Those 4 imported luxury vehicles sitting in your garage are all leased under incredibly restrictive terms. You have 5 platinum credit cards currently maxed out to their absolute limits. You owe hundreds of thousands of dollars in unsecured personal loans. Your pristine credit score is a complete fantasy. Your net worth is not just zero, Richard. It is catastrophically negative. You are drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt, and you have absolutely no way to pay it back. Richard was completely silent. The angry red flush had entirely vanished from his face, leaving him looking pale, sick, and suddenly very old. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Those local banks and private lenders finally got tired of your empty promises, Richard. I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. Last month, they bundled all of your mortgages and personal loans into a single distressed debt portfolio, and they sold it to the highest bidder. I bought your debt, Richard. I own your house. I am your absolute worst nightmare because I am your bank, and I am officially calling every single penny of it in. My words hung in the air, pressing down on my father until his broad shoulders physically slumped. He stared up at me from his table, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The booming, authoritative patriarch who just seconds ago was bragging about his $2 million suburban estate and his country club prestige was entirely gone. In his place sat a terrified, broke old man, realizing his lifelong game of financial smoke and mirrors had just ended in a catastrophic crash. Down at the table, Patricia was clutching her chest, her face pale and streaked with tears. Amanda was staring at the table, unable to process the fact that the golden family image she built her entire personality around was a massive lie. And Andre was still slumped in his chair. They had all treated me like a peasant trespassing in their royal court, completely unaware that I was the one who actually owned the castle. David sat beside me in our elevated booth. He nodded slightly, signaling it was time to deliver the final lethal blow. I reached into the thick black leather folder. My fingers bypassed the corporate charters and the financial audit, settling on a heavy stack of legal paper bound by a thick red seal. I pulled it out and held it over the velvet barrier of the VIP booth. Michael, our perfectly trained waiter, stepped forward immediately. I handed him the heavy document and he carried it down the short flight of stairs, placing it on top of Richard's unpaid $6,200 dinner bill. Richard stared at the document as if it were coated in poison. He refused to touch it. His hands remained gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles stark white. "What is that?" Richard whispered, his voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the velvet rail, my voice perfectly clear and unyielding. "That is an official notice of foreclosure," I replied smoothly. "Signed, stamped, and filed with the state court this very morning. You see, Richard, when Apex Holdings acquired your massive portfolio of toxic debt, We immediately conducted a standard audit of your payment history. You have missed 3 consecutive payments on your second and third mortgages. You are in default on your unsecured personal loans. By the strict legal terms of your borrowing agreements, the bank has the right to demand immediate payment in full. And since I am the bank, I am exercising that right now, tonight. Richard let out a strangled gasp. He looked at the blue paper of his updated will still lying forgotten on the restaurant floor near his expensive leather shoes. The irony of the situation was absolutely beautiful. I pointed down at the discarded document. A few minutes ago, you threw a massive temper tantrum in the middle of a Michelin-starred restaurant, I said, keeping my tone conversational, but incredibly sharp. You pulled out that will and screamed that you were officially disinheriting me. You tried to use your money as a weapon to punish me for not bowing down to your massive ego. You threatened to give all your wealth to Amanda and Andre because they are the only ones who respect you. But here is the cold, hard reality of your situation, Richard. You cannot disinherit me because there is absolutely nothing left to inherit. You do not have an estate to pass down. You have a mountain of defaulted debt, and I own every single rock on that mountain. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sob, grabbing Richard's arm. Tell her she cannot do this, Richard. Patricia wailed, her fake sweetness entirely replaced by sheer terror. Tell her she has to give us more time. We are her parents. Richard tried to muster a final spark of his old, intimidating anger. He glared up at me, his face twisted in desperation. You cannot just take my house, Lauren. He spat, his voice shaking. I will call my lawyers. I will call the bank presidents at my country club. I have powerful friends in this city. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 10 years. I smiled, a calm, patient smile. You do not have the money to hire a lawyer. Richard, I reminded him gently. And those powerful friends at your country club are the exact same people who happily sold your defaulted debt to my company to get you off their books. They do not respect you. They were just waiting for you to drown so they could cut you loose. Your country club membership dues are 3 months behind. The moment this foreclosure goes public, your precious reputation in that community will be completely destroyed. You will be a laughingstock. Richard sank back into his chair, totally defeated. The fight drained completely out of him, leaving an empty, hollow shell. He looked at the notice of foreclosure sitting on the table, the red seal mocking his lifetime of arrogant financial decisions. Lauren, I am your father. You cannot put your own mother and father out on the street. Where are we supposed to go? You have to show us some mercy. I looked down at the man who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel worthless. The man who had intentionally excluded me from his birthday dinner, then demanded I pay his massive bill just to humiliate me. I remembered every single time he had belittled my career, mocked my choices, and chosen his golden child over me. You did not invite your daughter to dinner tonight, Richard. I said, my voice dropping to a cold, absolute zero. You invited the bank, and the bank is informing you that your account is delinquent. You have 30 days to vacate the property before the sheriff arrives to remove you. I suggest you start packing tonight. The crushing weight of the foreclosure notice sitting on the table finally shattered the last remaining illusion of control my family had. Richard was completely silent, staring blankly at the red legal seal that officially ended his reign as the wealthy patriarch. But while Richard retreated into a state of catatonic shock, my mother Patricia went in the exact opposite direction. Her carefully constructed mask of weaponized incompetence and fake sugary sweetness completely dissolved. The polished country club matriarch vanished, instantly replaced by a terrified, desperate woman who was about to lose the only thing she actually cared about, which was her social status. Patricia let out a loud, hysterical sob that echoed sharply across the quiet dining room. She stood up from her chair, her knees shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the table just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfectly applied expensive makeup. She looked up at my elevated booth, her eyes wide with a frantic, wild panic. "Lauren, please," she wailed, her voice cracking under the intense emotional strain. "You cannot do this. You cannot take our home away from us. We are your parents. I watched her cry from my comfortable leather seat, feeling absolutely nothing. For decades, my mother had used tears as a manipulative tool to get exactly what she wanted. Whenever someone challenged her or called out her toxic behavior, she would instantly play the victim crying until everyone else apologized just to keep the peace. But tonight, her tears were not a tactical maneuver. They were born of genuine, absolute terror. She reached a trembling hand out toward me, as if she could physically bridge the massive gap she had spent 33 years creating between us. "Lauren, listen to me," Patricia begged, her voice loud and entirely devoid of her usual refined elegance. "I know we have had our disagreements in the past. I know your father can be difficult sometimes, but we are blood. We are family. You cannot just throw your own mother and father out onto the street like we are strangers. We raised you. We put a roof over your head and food on your table. You have to remember that you are family. You have to show us some mercy, honey. We will change. We will do whatever you want us to do." She was practically hyperventilating now, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the string looked like it might snap. Down at the table, Amanda was crying just as hard, watching our mother completely fall apart. Andre was staring at the floor, entirely paralyzed. They were all waiting for me to soften. They were waiting for the obedient scapegoat to reemerge. They fully expected me to look at my weeping mother, feel a massive wave of overwhelming guilt, and tear up the foreclosure papers right then and there. Because in their minds, family meant I was permanently obligated to endure their abuse and bail them out of their own terrible choices. I leaned forward, resting my arms gracefully on the velvet barrier that separated my reality from theirs. I did not raise my voice. I did not sound angry or bitter. I spoke with the calm, detached precision of a surgeon cutting out a cancerous tumor. "You are right about one thing, Mom," I said softly, my voice carrying effortlessly down to their table. "You did raise me. You put a roof over my head. But you also made sure I knew every single day that I was a massive disappointment to you." I kept my gaze locked directly on Patricia, watching the desperate hope slowly drain from her tear-stained face. "You want to talk about family now that you need my money?" I continued, the words flowing smoothly without a single trace of hesitation. "Where was this deep devotion to family when you ordered a $4,000 bottle of wine tonight and tried to stick me with the bill? Where was this family loyalty when you sat there and listened to Amanda tell me I should go eat a burger at the bar because I was ruining the aesthetic of your expensive dinner? You did not want me here tonight. You only invited me because you wanted an audience to witness Andre getting promoted. You wanted to rub your fake wealth in my face and remind me of my place at the bottom of the hierarchy. You were perfectly happy to watch me be humiliated. You were smiling when Richard told the waiter to bring the check to my table. You only remembered that we are family the exact second you realized I was the one holding the deed to your house and the keys to your entire future." Patricia let out a quiet, choked gasp, covering her face with her trembling hands. She had absolutely no defense because every single word I said was the undeniable truth. She slowly sank back down into her chair, completely defeated by the cold, hard reality of the boundaries I was permanently establishing. I shifted my attention back to Richard, who was still staring blankly at the red seal on the legal document. I needed him to hear this final truth before I ended the conversation forever. "Richard." I called out, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the dining room. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes hollow and completely empty. I looked directly into the face of the man who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. "You thought you were so clever when you sent that text message earlier," I said, my tone dropping to a chilling absolute zero. "You thought it was a brilliant power move to exclude me. But you made a catastrophic miscalculation. You did not forget my seat tonight, Dad. You forgot that I was the one paying for the chair you are sitting on right now in my restaurant." My words hung over the dining room. He had 30 days to vacate my property. For a few seconds, Richard just sat there breathing heavily. His eyes darted to the foreclosure document resting on the table. Then his fragile ego violently snapped. He could not accept defeat. He could not accept that the daughter he viewed as a worthless scapegoat had systematically dismantled his reality in front of strangers. He let out a primal roar of sheer unadulterated rage. He lunged forward and snatched the heavy legal document off the table. His thick fingers grasped the crisp paper, tearing it with animalistic fury. "You think a piece of paper means anything to me?" Richard screamed, ripping the document in half and throwing the pieces onto the white linen tablecloth. "You think you can just hand me a piece of paper and take my house? I will destroy you, Lauren. I will drag your little holding company into court and expose you for the fraud you are. I will make sure you spend the rest of your pathetic life paying my legal fees." He was practically frothing at the mouth as he shouted. He swept his arm across the table, knocking over 2 crystal water glasses and a small silver bread basket. The glass shattered loudly against the floor, sending water sliding under the adjacent tables. Patricia shrieked and jumped back, pressing herself against the plush seating. Amanda covered her head with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Even Andre flinched away from the sudden burst of violence. "Richard, please stop," Patricia begged hysterically, looking around at the surrounding tables. "Everyone is watching us. You are making a terrible scene. We have to leave." But Richard was beyond reason. He pointed a shaking finger up at my elevated booth, his face a horrifying shade of purple. "I am not leaving until she gets down here and apologizes to me," he bellowed. "I am the patriarch of this family. I demand respect. I will not be spoken to this way by an ungrateful little brat who thinks she is better than her own blood." I did not move. I did not flinch when the glass shattered. I just looked down at him with the cold, clinical observation of a scientist watching a failed experiment combust. Next to me, David let out a quiet sigh. The entertainment value of the evening had officially expired. It was time to clean up the mess. David did not say a word. He simply raised his right hand and made a very subtle, brief gesture, catching the eye of the general manager, who had been waiting patiently near the kitchen doors. Thomas moved with the swift, terrifying efficiency of a highly trained hospitality professional executing a pre-planned protocol. He did not come alone. 2 massive security guards dressed in immaculate black suits materialized from the shadows near the entrance and flanked him as he walked briskly toward Richard's table. The presence of the security detail sent a visible ripple of tension through the dining room. The other wealthy patrons watched in hushed silence as the consequences of Richard's violent outburst finally arrived. Richard was mid-sentence when he suddenly realized he was surrounded. He stopped shouting as he looked at the 2 towering security guards standing inches from his chair. Thomas stepped forward, his face a mask of pure professional ice. He looked at the torn pieces of the foreclosure notice scattered across the table and the shattered crystal on the floor. Sir Thomas said, his voice completely devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for guests. "You are destroying restaurant property and disturbing the peace of our dining room. That behavior is completely unacceptable at the Monarch. I must ask you to lower your voice immediately and prepare to vacate the premises." Richard blinked, his anger momentarily short-circuiting in the face of absolute authority. He looked up at Thomas, his jaw clenching. "I am a paying customer," Richard growled, though his voice was noticeably quieter. "I am celebrating my birthday. My daughter up there is the one causing the problem. She is harassing my family." Thomas did not even acknowledge the excuse. Instead, he smoothly produced the black leather folio containing the final dinner receipt. He placed it firmly on the table right over the torn pieces of the foreclosure document. He tapped the leather cover once. "You are indeed a customer, sir," Thomas replied smoothly. "And as a customer, you have an outstanding balance of $6,200. Since you have now caused property damage, I must insist that you settle this bill immediately before security escorts you out of the building." Richard stared at the leather folio. The anger evaporated, replaced by the crushing reality of his financial situation. He looked at the bill and then looked up at me. He genuinely believed that despite everything that had just happened, the restaurant would simply write off the meal to avoid a larger scandal. "You cannot be serious," Richard stammered. "I am not paying this. My daughter is the owner. You just told everyone she owns this building. Owners do not charge their own family for a birthday dinner. You need to comp this meal right now. It is the least you can do. Thomas stood perfectly straight. It is true that our standard policy allows the owner to authorize complimentary meals for VIP guests. Thomas explained, his voice carrying clearly to the surrounding tables. However, Mrs. Caldwell explicitly instructed me that under no circumstances is this table to receive a discount. She informed me that anyone who insults the owner of the establishment will pay full market price for their arrogance. Thomas took a step back. So, sir, you will pay the $6,200 in full right now. If your payment declines, or if you refuse to pay, I will not hesitate to call the Chicago Police Department and have you arrested for theft. The choice is entirely yours, sir. Richard stared at Thomas and the two massive security guards standing like statues beside him. The threat of the Chicago Police Department being called was the final nail in the coffin of his rebellion. He knew he could not bluster his way out of a criminal theft charge. His chest heaved as he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his thick leather wallet. His hands were shaking so badly that he fumbled the leather, dropping a few business cards onto the floor. He ignored them. He pulled out the heavy metallic gold credit card he loved to flash at country club dinners. He thrust it toward Thomas with a look of pure venom. "Just run the card." Richard spat, his voice a harsh, desperate whisper. "Run the card and get out of my face. I am not spending another second in this miserable establishment." Thomas did not react to the insult. He calmly took the gold card and retrieved a sleek black handheld payment terminal from his tailored jacket pocket. He inserted the chip right there at the table, ensuring that Richard and my family could watch the transaction process in real time. The digital screen on the terminal flashed processing. For a brief second, Richard lifted his chin, trying to regain a fraction of his lost dignity. He hoped the plastic still carried some weight. But then the terminal let out a sharp, loud beep. The screen flashed bright red. Declined. Thomas pulled the card out and handed it back without a change in his expression. "I am sorry," Sir Thomas said smoothly. "Your institution has declined the charge." Richard snatched the card back, his face flushing an angry red again. "Your machine is broken," he snapped, refusing the truth. "Run this one." He pulled out a silver platinum card and shoved it at Thomas. Thomas inserted the chip. Processing. Beep. Declined. Richard's eyes widened in genuine panic as sweat began to bead on his forehead. He dug into his wallet and pulled out two more cards, handing them both over. "Try them both," he demanded, his voice rising in high-pitched panic. Thomas ran the third card. Declined. He ran the fourth card. Declined. Every single line of credit Richard had carefully maintained to build his fake empire was entirely shut off. The machine beeped over and over again, broadcasting his absolute financial ruin to the entire dining room. Down at the table, Andre suddenly sat up straight. The fog of his own career destruction lifted just enough for him to understand exactly what was happening with the credit cards. Andre had spent the last 3 years managing the financial optics for Richard, ensuring his accounts looked healthy to the outside world. He looked at David up in the VIP booth and then down at the black folder sitting on the table. Andre realized the terrifying efficiency of what my husband had just done. When David fired Andre's brokerage firm, he also triggered an automatic internal review of all affiliated accounts. And since I had just purchased Richard's entire debt portfolio through Apex Holdings, David had the legal authority to place an immediate preemptive freeze on all over-leveraged assets. Andre looked at Richard with wide, horrified eyes. "Richard, your accounts are frozen," Andre said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "The bank locked everything down. When Apex acquired your debt, they flagged your credit lines for high-risk default. You do not have access to a single penny. You are completely locked out of the financial system. You cannot buy coffee." Richard stared at Andre, unable to comprehend the words. He looked down at his useless plastic cards scattered across the white tablecloth like dead leaves. He was sitting in a luxury restaurant facing a massive bill and a potential police escort with absolutely $0 to his name. Thomas cleared his throat, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence. Sir Thomas said, looking directly at Richard, with eyes like ice. I need a valid form of payment right now. If you cannot provide one, I will signal security to contact the authorities immediately. Patricia began to cry harder, gripping Richard's arm with both hands. We are going to be arrested, Richard, she sobbed, her voice echoing in the quiet room. Do something, please do something. But Richard had nothing left to do. He was completely empty. That is when Amanda slowly reached for her designer purse. Her hands were shaking violently as she unzipped the compartment and pulled out a bright blue emergency credit card. It was the card she and Andre kept strictly for extreme situations. The card they swore they would never touch because of its massive predatory interest rate. Amanda held the blue card out toward Thomas. Her perfectly highlighted hair was a mess, and expensive mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. Use this, Amanda, whispered her voice cracking under the weight of her new reality. Please use this so we can leave. Thomas took the card with a polite nod and inserted it into the terminal. Processing. The screen flashed a bright green. Approved. Thomas printed the long, itemized receipt and placed it on the table. Thank you, madam, Thomas said, stepping back. Security will now escort you all to the exit. Have a safe evening. Amanda stared at the receipt, the numbers blurring through her tears. She just spent $6,200 on a birthday dinner for a father who lied to her about his wealth. She looked at her husband Andre, who was now unemployed and blacklisted from his entire industry. She looked at her parents, who were 30 days away from being completely homeless. The reality of her new life crashed down on her all at once. The golden child who had spent her entire life mocking me was now the sole financial provider for a ruined family, and she had just gone into massive debt to buy her way out of my restaurant. The loud chirp of the credit card machine approving Amanda's transaction echoed through the dining room. It was the only sound at their table. There was no dramatic swelling music and no final explosive shouting match. There was only the cold, heavy reality of absolute consequence. Amanda slowly pulled her blue emergency credit card from the payment terminal. Her hands were shaking so violently she dropped it twice before finally sliding it back into her designer purse. She had just wiped out her entire financial safety net to pay for a dinner she did not even enjoy. She looked at Richard, waiting for him to say something reassuring. She wanted her father to tell her he would pay her back tomorrow, or that he had a secret offshore account to fix all of this. But Richard did not say a single word. He just stared blankly at the white linen tablecloth. His massive ego had been completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Thomas stepped back and gave a crisp professional nod to the two towering security guards standing behind Richard's chair. The guards moved forward in perfect synchronization. They did not grab anyone or use physical force. They simply stood there, radiating an imposing, undeniable authority. It is time to leave, Thomas said, his voice calm and entirely devoid of emotion. Please gather your belongings and walk toward the front exit. Do not cause any further disruptions on your way out. Patricia let out one last pathetic sob, clutching her pearl necklace as she reached for her expensive handbag. She stood up on trembling legs, leaning heavily against the table for support. Andre stood up next, his movements slow and robotic. The confident, arrogant corporate executive who had swaggered up to my booth an hour ago was completely gone. He was just an unemployed man in a ruined suit facing an absolutely terrifying future. Richard was the last to stand. He pushed himself up from his chair, looking incredibly frail. For my entire life, he had projected the image of an untouchable titan, a man who commanded respect through fear and financial manipulation. But as he stood there, surrounded by restaurant security, he just looked like a sad, broken old man. He did not look up at my elevated booth. He did not dare make eye contact with me again. He knew that the daughter he had spent 33 years treating like a worthless scapegoat had just permanently dismantled his entire life. The security guards gestured toward the main aisle leading to the heavy mahogany front doors. The long walk of shame officially began. I stood at the velvet barrier of the VIP booth watching them go. I felt no urge to yell after them or gloat about my victory. The silence was far more powerful than any insult I could have thrown. The dining room of the Monarch is filled with the most elite and powerful citizens of Chicago. Bank presidents, real estate developers, and corporate executives were all sitting at their tables watching my family being formally escorted out by security. It was the exact nightmare Richard had spent his entire life trying to avoid. He was being publicly humiliated in front of the exact high society crowd he desperately wanted to impress. The elite patrons watched in hushed silence, judging them with the cold, detached curiosity of the ultra-wealthy. My family kept their heads down, staring at the expensive carpet as they walked out the doors and disappeared into the crisp autumn night. They were gone. The toxic heavy energy that had suffocated me for decades walked out those doors with them. I turned around and let out a long, slow breath. I felt incredibly light. The heavy, invisible chains of seeking their approval and enduring their constant abuse were permanently broken. I sat back down on the plush leather seat of the owner booth. David sat down next to me, a warm, proud smile spreading across his handsome face. He reached out and gently took my hand, squeezing it affectionately. "You handled that beautifully," David said, his voice soft and full of genuine admiration. "You gave them every single opportunity to just eat their dinner and be a family, but they chose war. You just gave them the exact war they asked for." I leaned my head against his shoulder, letting the tension fully leave my body. For the first time in my entire life, I did not feel the desperate need to apologize for my own existence. I did not feel guilty for protecting myself. I realized that setting a boundary is only difficult until you finally see exactly what you are protecting. I was finally protecting our beautiful shared future. I smiled back at him, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of peace. Michael, our perfectly trained waiter, stepped up to the platform carrying a silver tray. He placed 2 pristine crystal wine glasses on our table. Then he produced a dark green bottle with a familiar vintage label. It was a fresh, unopened bottle of the exact same 1990 Chateau Margaux that Patricia had tried to weaponize against me earlier. Michael uncorked the bottle with flawless precision, pouring the rich, dark ruby liquid into our glasses. He gave a respectful bow and quietly retreated, leaving David and me alone in our private, elevated sanctuary. I picked up my crystal glass, feeling the cool, elegant weight of it in my hand. David picked up his glass and held it up toward the sparkling chandelier above us. "To the end of an era," David said softly, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "And to the beginning of a beautiful, peaceful new one." I raised my glass, clinking it gently against his. The pure, resonant sound of crystal meeting crystal rang out, signaling the absolute end of the family drama. "To peace," I replied. I took a slow sip of the $4,000 wine. It tasted absolutely incredible. It tasted like freedom. The clink of our crystal glasses felt like closing a heavy iron door on my past. I took another slow sip of the Chateau Margaux, letting the rich, complex flavors wash over my palate. Down on the main dining floor, the energy of the monarch was already returning to normal. The elite patrons of Chicago had witnessed the spectacle, gossiped in hushed whispers, and then seamlessly returned to their expensive steaks and corporate deal-making. My family was gone. They had been physically removed from the premises and permanently removed from my life. I looked at the empty table where they had been sitting just minutes ago. The shattered crystal had been swept away by the impeccably trained staff. The white linen tablecloth was completely smooth. It was as if Richard, Patricia, Amanda, and Andre had never even been there. David reached across our small, intimate table and gently rested his hand over mine. His thumb traced slow, reassuring circles on my skin. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew me better than anyone, and he could clearly see the profound relief radiating from my posture. For 33 years, I had walked around with a heavy, invisible knot in my chest. It was the crushing weight of their constant expectations, endless criticisms, and desperate need to keep me small. Every holiday dinner and forced family vacation had been a battlefield where I was expected to surrender my self-worth to keep the peace. But sitting in that elevated booth, looking out over the empire I had built with my own 2 hands, I realized the knot was completely gone. I took a deep breath of the truffle-scented air and felt my lungs expand fully for the first time. We sat there for another hour, simply enjoying the sanctuary we had created. Michael brought us a delicate dessert course crafted by the executive chef, but we barely touched it. The sweetest thing on the table was the undeniable truth that we had won. We had not won by screaming or throwing tantrums or threatening people with imaginary legal documents. We had won by operating in absolute reality. My father had spent his entire life building a massive, fragile illusion of wealth and power. He leveraged his house, his cars, and his daughter's future just to maintain a facade for strangers at a country club. He genuinely believed that his loud voice and aggressive bullying could rewrite the facts of his financial ruin. But the cold, hard reality of the business world does not care about your fragile ego. Reality only cares about absolute leverage. When you build your entire identity on toxic debt and lies, you give the rest of the world the power to tear you down. I simply chose to be the one holding the wrecking ball. I looked at David, feeling a surge of overwhelming gratitude for the man who had stood beside me. He never told me to just forgive and forget. He never tried to convince me that family is everything. Instead, he helped me quietly build an impenetrable fortress of financial and emotional independence. He helped me gather the corporate intelligence I desperately needed to protect myself from their endless manipulation. He understood that true freedom does not come from waiting for toxic people to apologize or change their behavior. Toxic people do not change. They only change their tactics when they lose control. True freedom comes from completely severing the roots they have planted in your life and walking away completely clean. I had walked into this restaurant expecting a difficult, uncomfortable birthday dinner. I was walking out as the absolute master of my own destiny. As we finally stood up to leave, the general manager, Thomas, approached our booth with a warm, respectful smile. He held my coat and thanked us for our visit, completely ignoring the massive family explosion that had occurred earlier. I thanked him for his flawless execution of the evening. Walking out of the heavy mahogany doors of the Monarch, the crisp Chicago air hit my face. The city lights sparkled against the dark night sky. I did not know where my parents would go in 30 days when the sheriff arrived to execute the foreclosure. I did not know how Amanda and Andre would survive without their corporate salaries and their luxury cars. And for the first time in my life, I realized it was absolutely not my problem to solve. I had spent decades trying to fix their mistakes, absorbing their cruel words, and bending over backward to earn a love that was never going to be freely given. They had dug their own graves with their greed, their pride, and their complete lack of basic human decency. I stepped into the waiting black town car, leaving the ashes of my toxic family history scattered on the pavement behind me. As the car pulled away from the curb, I looked out the tinted window at the beautiful building I owned. I thought about the scared little girl who used to hide in her bedroom to escape her father's rage and her mother's fake sweetness. That little girl was gone forever. I leaned my head against the luxurious leather seat and closed my eyes, allowing a genuine, joyful smile to spread across my face. It had been a long, difficult road to reach this moment, but it was worth every step. I had successfully completely dismantled the toxic hierarchy that governed my existence. I proved that blood does not give anyone a free pass to inflict endless emotional and financial abuse. I successfully reclaimed my inner peace, my personal power, and my entirely unshakable sense of self-worth. The king and queen of the country club had been officially dethroned by the very daughter they tried to discard. The nightmare was finally permanently over. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but you have to buy the landfill to properly dispose of it. The most profound lesson I learned is that true power does not roar. It observes, calculates, and operates entirely within the boundaries of undeniable facts. My family spent my life relying on emotional manipulation and aggressive threats to keep me trapped as the scapegoat. They truly believed that as long as they projected an image of perfect wealth, they were entirely untouchable. But toxic people are almost always building their castles on sand. When you stop fighting them with emotions and start fighting them with absolute unyielding logic, their entire reality simply collapses. I learned that you cannot heal in the environment that made you sick. You have to make the excruciating choice to walk away from the people who share your blood in order to protect your soul. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire simply to keep toxic family members warm. The greatest revenge you can ever achieve is absolute total independence. You must build your own empire, cultivate your chosen family, and establish boundaries that are impenetrable. As I look back on that incredible night, I realize something vital about dealing with toxic people. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but sometimes you have to buy the landfill to properly dispose of it. Have you ever had to establish a firm financial or emotional boundary with a toxic family member who refused to respect you? I would love to hear your personal stories and experiences in the comments section below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more stories about overcoming family trauma, claiming independence, and building a successful life on your own terms. Remember, your worth is never determined by the people who are too blind to see it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.